This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Justin Waggoner, K-State beef cattle specialist, starts today's show as he recaps the recent Focus on Feedlot report and where cattle are currently finishing in terms of weight. The show continues with Jacob Orser, program support specialist with NASA Acres, as he discusses NASA's STELLA and what he'll be teaching kids at the upcoming Ag Tech Day. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends the show saying how recent studies show that a BMR male sterile sorghum hybrid can effectively replace about 25 to 30% of the corn silage in a lactating cow's diet. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with a focus on feedlots from K-State Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner. Justin, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Shelby.
Justin, what is the focus on feedlots before we talk about the data with it?
Just to provide everyone a little bit of background on the K-State Focus on Feedlots. So the K-State Focus on Feedlots is essentially a summary of feedlot closeout and performance information. So it's data that we collect via a survey from 5 different cattle feeders, mostly in western Kansas, across the western half of the state. And so what's really unique about the Focus on Feedlot effort that we do here at K-State is this is the only publicly available source of real-time feedlot closeout and performance data. And so that's pretty unique to K-State. The other aspect of the Focus on Feedlots is there's also a historical data set. So we've got the data archived electronically for 35 years now. So we have a 35-year data set to work from. And so it's just really unique to have a data set that has that much longevity, but is also one of the few sources of information in terms of feedlot industry numbers and cattle performance.
And while we're looking at the most recent report, what month is it focused on?
Sure, great question, Shelby. So we always collect the data. We're always a little bit behind in terms of the current month. So the February report that we'll be discussing is actually the January 26 closeout information. The cattle numbers will all be reflective of January 26 closeouts. But when we talk about commodity prices and place cost to gain on the cattle, those numbers will actually be reflective of, let's say, mid-February.
Looking at January 2026 closeout information, what are some big points you saw for that month?
You know, really kind of the 30,000 foot level of the data that we collect. I think one of the conversation points that's especially apparent this month would be feedlot exit weights. We know cattle have certainly gotten bigger. The question is, you know, how much have they changed and what the ceiling is, or how big can we make them in the industry? I think those are two of the questions that are out there. The January 26 closeouts, the final exit weight of the feedlot steers is 1559, and that is an average feedlot exit weight on over 23,000 head of steers. Now, on the heifer side of the equation, feedlot exit weights for January 26 were 1,390 pounds, and that number is reflective of over 15,000 head of heifers. So essentially, we have an industry that in January 26 was marketing feedlot steers at 1,560 and heifers at 1,400 pounds. That's certainly a change from where we would have been even a few years ago. We certainly added some additional exit weight onto those cattle.
We've talked about this with our livestock economist, but from your perspective as a beef cattle specialist, can the cattle get much bigger?
You know, that's a great question. I think it's one the industry is really trying to figure out right now. That's a common question of, you know, where is that ceiling in terms of those exit weights? I think, you know, more broadly, you start to think about the situation that really has set this up, right? You mentioned from an economic perspective, one of the tightest cattle feeder supplies that we have in terms of cattle inventory. And I think that's a big factor behind the cattle feeder, you know, putting on additional days on feed, but also carrying these cattle to heavier exit weights. Also have very strong demand in the industry too, in terms of beef. So, you know, those two factors themselves, the tighter inventory supply, feeding cost of gain with corn prices, you know, those are all moving in a direction that's certainly favorable for a cattle feeder to look at, you know, carrying these cattle extra days and maybe adding a few extra pounds on them as well.
And with these 5 yards, what's the average days on feed?
We might just kind of start to roll through the numbers a little bit and kind of talk about each one of them as we go. So As I said before, the data that we're going to talk about here today is reflective of 5 feed yards, mostly in western Kansas. So 23,000 head of steers will be represented and 15,000 head of heifers. So average days on feed for this January 2026 closeout was 184 days. The heifers were on feed for 175 days. I do want to point out in terms of the range, we also seeing some cattle go well over that 200-day mark. The range on the steers was 162 to 221, and the range on the heifers was 155 to 216. So certainly seeing those cattle feeders carried some of those cattle well in excess of that 200 days on feed mark. If we think about average daily gain and those traditional performance, measurements, we can talk about those a little bit. But steer average daily gain, January 26, average was a 3.82. Range was 3.4 to 4.25. So over 4.25 pounds a day on some of these bigger cattle. That's fairly impressive. As we look at the heifers, 3.43 on the average, 3.11 to 3.8 on the range there in terms of average daily gain. Feed conversion, 6.4 on the steers, 6.7 on the heifers. We are seeing some of the heifers, push into the upper sevens in terms of feed conversion, but still very favorable fed cattle performance here outside of those heifers that maybe gave up a little feed conversion later in the feeding period. If we get into death loss numbers, we often talk about, what is average death loss in the feedlot industry, and this is a month where we're really probably right on trend line for both the steers as well as the heifers in terms of death loss at 1.25 on the steers and 1.49% on the heifers. In terms of cost of gain, so this would be average cost of gain on the cattle in terms of the closeout month. Average was 100.86, so with a range of 89 to 113, and that number is per hundredweight on the steers. And then the heifers were at 108.34 with a range of 95 to 120.47 on the heifers. So 100 and 108. So we do see about an $8 spread between the steers and heifers, which is fairly common as well. As we move into kind of the place numbers and commodity prices and projected costs of gain, fairly strong consensus this month across our feed yard managers in the survey. With projected cost of gain for cattle that would be placed on feed in February, so mid-February, 100 on those steers and 107 on the heifers. So in terms of our commodity prices, average corn price priced at the feed yard was $4.57 a bushel with a range of $4.40 to $4.75. Alfalfa hay, we record that as well, and that was $139.20 per ton with a range of $127.60 to $155 per ton on the ground alfalfa hay across those yards.
Justin, I want to present a scenario. So right now, our cattle herd numbers are obviously very small, and we're putting more weight on our animals for slaughter. But if our cattle herd size goes back up, are we going to keep putting that same amount of weight on our animals?
That's a really intuitive question. I think the industry is actually asking that very question right now. If feeder supply starts to change, if we see more available cattle, will we begin to take those cattle and reduce those exit weights? And in my opinion, I think what this scenario has taught us in the industry is we can actually carry some of these cattle to heavier exit weights, especially now in a pretty favorable cost of gain or corn price scenario, right? So there's a lot of factors that are complicated in terms of how many days on feed do we take, what's the cost to refill that pen of cattle, relative to those feeding costs and all of those other factors that we've talked about. But I think that's an important consideration in my own personal opinion. I think we may see those days on feed come down slightly, but I think as an industry, we are certainly entering an area where we have cattle that we know we can carry those additional days on feed. We can hang those additional pounds in terms of that carcass that's out there. And so we may see those soften a little bit, is my opinion, but we're certainly going to stay in an area where we're certainly going to see these bigger cattle continue to be marketed.
And what factors, when you look at this, are you seeing being the biggest components for feed yards wanting to refill their pens?
As we've alluded to here several times, that cattle inventory supply and feeder calf supply is really a critical issue. I think as you talk to many cattle feeders, look at the difference in terms of 23,000 head of steers in these feedlots and 15,000 head of heifers. That's 8,000 fewer heifers, right? And we could go back and do some month-in comparisons, right? But that's a very strong number of heifers that are still entering the feedlot segment in terms of that 15,000 number that's there. So, but certainly the cattle inventory supply is a big part of that discussion, I think, right now.
So, as you have been working on the focus on feedlots, are you surprised by any of these numbers?
Um, they change from month to month. So there's always a number in a few months that will oftentimes kind of pique my interest, especially this month. I think seeing cattle go, kind of break 1550 on the steers on that average. I think that's a number that jumps out to me that I was a little surprised to see that one go that high. And the heifers really approaching that 1,400 pound benchmark. These would be some of the historically the highest exit weights that we've seen in 35 years of this data set. So they would be, these are very high exit weights in terms of this data set. So just those are the two numbers in this month's closeout that I would say, okay, wow, I'm surprised that they're maybe as high as what they are, but they're certainly knocking on the door some historic values for us.
If people want to find this data, how can they do that?
Yeah, so ksubeef.org on the KSU Beef team is a great place to start within the website. The focus on feedlots is actually available on that website. It has its own webpage where you can view all of the closeout months. I think we take those back several years as well, depending on what we can fit in the archive pages. But in addition to that, we also disseminate the focus on feedlots just via a simple email listserv. So if listeners would like to have that report come directly to their inbox each month, all they need to do is send me an email at jwagon@ksu.edu, or my contact information is also listed on ksubeef.org, and we can get that report to where that comes directly to your inbox each month.
Justin, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
That was K-State Extension Beef Cattle Specialist Justin Waggoner. I will link the resources that he mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing an activity that's at the upcoming Ag Tech Day, which is taking place April 4th. And then to talk about this upcoming activity, we have Program Support Specialist with NASA Acres, Jacob Orser. Jacob, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Jacob, at this upcoming Ag Tech Day, what will you be sharing with participants?
Yeah, so I'll be representing and partnering with NASA STELLA. And so these are handheld spectrometers. And so they mimic the view of satellites. And so we're able to use them as educational materials as well as training data and more comprehensive science. So we do everything from teaching kids about remote sensing and spectrometers all the way up to high-grade research quality papers with these STELLAs.
And what does STELLA stand for?
It's a long acronym that I think is just now become a household name for us. But it is something that this educational workforce part of Landsat team, and so it's able to mimic the Landsat and become its own device.
And while we're focused maybe a little bit more towards the youth today, who does use this and who can use it?
So anybody can use this. This is an amazing tool because it's open source material. So everything can be purchased and found online. We have a really great suite of YouTube videos and resources for you to build your own. And so anybody is welcome to use it. And we have training materials, like I said, online and on our website. And yeah, what we'll be focusing on at the Ag Tech Day and kind of our specialty is using this on the farm and in field trials and understanding more about what's going on at the smaller resolution, being able to track pests and disease, being able to understand kind of growth. And what we're working towards is so soil dynamics and understanding kind of evapotranspiration and soil moisture at this really high resolution level with these handheld spectrometers.
And can you break down a little bit of the science of those handheld spectrometers of how it all works?
Yeah, totally. We get the data from the reflection from the sunlight. And so these recorders are able to detect the red, green, and blue coloring, as well as kind of that more outside the visible spectrum. And so we get near infrared and SWIR bands that we're able to detect using the spectrometer. And the really nice thing is that it links up really well with the Landsat system. And so you can kind of combine this with the satellite data at a very easy way. And so this machine records the wavelengths that are provided back from the crop. And so we're able to see changes in vegetation health and provide numbers to what we're seeing on the ground. So from these numbers, we're able to detect soil moisture, evapotranspiration, vegetation health, and yeah, it just provides data to what we're seeing on the ground using this reflection.
You've mentioned the Landsat system a couple of times, and can you tell us a little bit about how these really do pair together?
Yeah, so this was born from the Landsat system. So Landsat is NASA's kind of largest suite of satellites, longest lasting satellite. It's up in space and it looks down at Earth and records photos. That we have this really rich time series going back to 1970s. So this was born from that as kind of a way to get spectrometers and remote sensing into the hands of people that actually use it, and kind of as this workforce development initiative help people understand what are spectrometers, what can they see, and then more about like what can I study with it. And so in terms of Landsat, it is NASA's gold standard. And so what we're doing here is trying to bring data back up to that level and give people an opportunity to play with the data on their hands and do really high quality scientific research with that data.
And how have you seen this be used in fields or with producers in agriculture?
So we have been working around the world doing field trials. So looking just because Landsat pixels are 30 meters by 30 meters, so we're getting one data value for every football field in length. These spectrometers are able to look what I say within the pixel, and so you're able to hold it over individual plants and understand kind of the dynamics of what's going on within that plant. And so these have been used in Mexico, in the US, and around the world to have that kind of within the pixel understanding of what's going on in that within field dynamics. And then it also has been used, like I mentioned, in that educational aspect. And so working with students to understand what's going on and kind of introduction to this remote sensing capabilities and platform.
And how have you been working to share this knowledge or science with youth?
Yeah, so we partnered with Garden City Community College to co-create a technology and agriculture curriculum where we use NASA STELLA as the kind of introduction to what is remote sensing, what can be seen, and kind of the dynamics of what makes a healthy plant versus a stressed plant. And so from there, we're hoping that they start to use it in kind of advanced classes, looking at kind of what more can be studied with remote sensing. Can you detect like nitrogen and disease and track that across the field? And so these are really exciting sensors because they are very easy to use, and it's really used for this kind of exploratory research. And so that's our goal is to continue working with community colleges and students across the U.S. and across Kansas to put them in the hands and really get them excited about remote sensing and understanding what the power of possible. Let them take it from there.
And obviously, we focused towards agriculture a little bit more today, but are there other applications for Stella as well?
Oh yeah, there are a ton. There are heliophysics, so looking at the dynamics within the air, understanding kind of parts per million of CO2 or other materials or gases that are in the air. And then it also works within water, so understanding turbidity and the micronutrients that are in the water. And so this is all because stellas do capture that light and the reflection of the light. And so we're able to kind of study the dynamics within these different systems just by looking at the light and how the light is bouncing and changing based on what objects we're looking at.
And so as you're hoping to teach this to students and kids, what is it like seeing their reaction, or how do they usually take in the information?
Yeah, it's super exciting. So one of the hardest things to kind of explain is outside the visible spectrum and understanding that light is an energy and comes in waves, and we're able to detect those waves. And so something like near infrared is not something that's super easily comprehensible, but this NASA Stella helps kind of promote and give data and give the introduction in a very visual clue about what is near infrared, what is light, how does it work, how does it change. And so you're able to have these very local, hands-on examples of this is what a healthy plant looks like in terms of a visible spectrum, and this is what a healthy plant looks like outside of what I can see. And so, and then this is a stress plant, and these are the differences. And so you get the scientific part of the brain turning, and it's just a very helpful tool for students to put actual numbers, and it's not this theoretical kind of high in the sky. This is a very tangible thing that I can go out into my backyard and start to study and start to look at. So yeah, that's what got me excited about it, about Stella, was I was able to go around to my plants in my house and in my backyard and look around and see if I could tell where they're stressed and which ones might need water first, and do my own science just using the ones that I built myself.
And what will kids get to do at Ag Tech Day?
Yeah, so I'm super excited about this. What I've created is a little game for students to use. They're going to take the Stellas and go around and measure plants and try to find healthy ones versus unhealthy or stress crops versus like bare soil. And then they're going to go in and label it all. And then we're going to do a machine learning program to see what the satellite could see and use this data that they're collecting as training data to try to understand what's going on at the field level. And so my goal here is just to get kids excited about what's going on from what they can see, and then what is beyond what they can see. So that near infrared and SWIR bands, these are things that are very helpful indicators about stress and what plants might be needing before they start to turn brown. And so this is a helpful tool that I'm really trying to get students excited about what is possible and what can data provide insights into. And so I'm really excited about that opportunity, is that it's supposed to be very interactive and very exciting for kids to just start to get a play with these stellas and try to understand what is beyond the visible spectrum, and then how can I use data to understand kind of the dynamics of what I'm seeing.
If people want to find out more information about NASA STELLA, how can they do that?
Visit our website. You can just look up NASA STELLA. They just redesigned the website and it's looking very good. There's a ton of videos on YouTube as well, just kind of walking through what a field day looks like, how to use it, how to build it your own. And there's super helpful resources on the website as well about where to go to buy these materials, and then you can build them yourself, following along on the YouTube videos. So yeah, definitely check out the website to learn more.
Jacob, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you so much.
That was Program Support Specialist with NASA Acres, Jacob Orser, and he'll be talking about NASA STELLA at the upcoming Ag Tech Day in Mountain Ridge, Kansas, which is a partnership between Flickner Innovation Farms and K-State. If you would like to get registered for this free event that's taking place Saturday, April 4th from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., you do need to get registered by April 1st. It is free and open to the public, but registration is required. I will put a link in today's show notes on agtoday.net that you can follow to get registered. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Corn silage is an excellent feed for lactating dairy cows, but it requires a lot of irrigation water. Sorghum silage requires less water, and K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says recent studies show that sorghum hybrids can effectively replace some corn silage in a lactating dairy cow's diet.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the forages that we choose for uses in our dairy operations. One of the things that we've long used in diets of lactating dairy cows is corn silage, and it's an excellent feed. However, one of the drawbacks of corn is that it requires a lot of irrigation water. Maybe choosing a type of forage that would require less water might be to our advantage. So, one of the things that we often discuss is sorghum silage and different sorghum hybrids that we might utilize. And in the past, we've tried many of these in dairy rations and generally as a total replacement for corn silage. Most of those experiments have not been very favorable when it comes to milk production, and therefore it has caused us as an industry to shy away from utilizing sorghum in the diets. However, if we look at some of the changes in forage genetics and how that's impacted sorghums that are available to us, we might want to take a second look at this particular crop. Now, how about on the feeding side? What things there can be done to improve the utilization of sorghum silage in our dairy rations? Well, one thing we might look at is the choice of the hybrid that we plant. Recent studies have shown that when you plant a BMR male sterile hybrid. These hybrids do not produce grain, but they have a much higher sugar content in the forage. When we replace 25 or 50% of the corn silage in a diet with this type of forage, research from Texas A&M has shown that we can see an increase in energy-corrected milk when feeding diets that contain some of the BMR male sterile sorghum hybrid. So, as we look at many of the older studies that have been conducted comparing corn silage and sorghum silage, need to recognize that these were different hybrids when it came to the types of sorghum that were tested, and generally, most of those studies, it was a full replacement, not a partial replacement for the corn silage in the lactating diet. Another major issue has been starch availability when we talk about the conventional forage sorghum hybrids that are available to us. The berry, or the seed of the sorghum plant, is very hard and has a dense seed coat. When we chop this for silage, we do very little generally to reduce the integrity of that seed coat. Therefore, the starch availability is not very good when we feed it to the dairy animal, and lots of that starch will actually pass out the rear of the animal and into the manure pile, so we don't get any benefit for the starch that is actually there. However, some equipment has been designed that does a better job of processing that sorghum berry, therefore breaking it up and making more starch available. In fact, some of the recent studies from Texas A&M have shown that the starch availability of in situ experiments have demonstrated that for sorghum silage processed with this new equipment, we would see about a 66% availability of the starch after 90 days of ensiling. This is very, very good news and demonstrates that there are some things that we can do to increase the starch availability and probably reduce the milk yield losses that we might see if we do utilize sorghum silage into the diets of lactating dairy cows. So, as you consider what types of forages you might grow, if water is limiting in your area or you're looking for ways to conserve the amount of irrigation water that is going into crop production for your dairy farm, you might want to consider these two items as you make your selections for forages and find a way to reduce the water needed to grow crops for your dairy without reducing the level of milk production in your herd. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.